He laughed. That was the part Imani could never unhear. Not the words, though the words were bad enough. It was the laugh. Easy, careless, the kind of laugh a man makes when he's completely certain he's untouchable. If this marriage fails, Jae-Min once said, one arm draped around an actress whose dress cost more than most people's monthly salary, champagne glass raised like a toast to his own brilliance, I'll just find another wife. The room exploded with laughter, and Imani Caldwell Kwan stood 7 feet away. She didn't gasp, didn't drop her glass, didn't make a single sound. She simply stood there, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, and let every word land exactly where it was aimed, straight through the center of 3 years of her life. If you've ever loved someone who made you invisible in a room full of people, this story is for you. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if something in this hits close to home, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. The party had been Jae-Min's idea, as most things were. Called it a celebration, a quarterly gathering for the inner circle of his organization, the people who moved money and muscle across 3 provinces and kept their mouths shut while doing it. But in practice, it was a performance. Everything Jae-Min did was a performance. The penthouse on the 42nd floor had been rented for the evening, not because he needed more space, his own residence was 3 floors above, but because optics mattered. The view of Incheon's harbor glittering below, the catering staff in pressed black uniforms, the ice sculptures sweating quietly in the corner, all of it was a message dressed up as a party. Imani had organized most of it, not visibly. She never did things visibly. She'd confirmed the catering order on Tuesday when Jae-Min forgot about it during a phone call that ran 4 hours. She'd handled a quiet scheduling conflict between 2 guests who despised each other, moving arrival times 40 minutes apart so the evening wouldn't collapse before it started. She'd called the florist twice because the original arrangement used white chrysanthemums, and she knew she had learned, through careful years of paying attention, that white flowers meant mourning to several of the older guests. Jae-Min didn't know she'd done any of that. He walked into the party like a man who had simply summoned a perfect evening from thin air. Imani wore a deep burgundy dress, not because it was her favorite color. Her favorite color was green, but because Jae-Min had mentioned once, 2 years ago, that she looked powerful in dark red. She'd held on to that comment, the way you hold on to a coin you're afraid to spend. She'd spent it tonight. He hadn't noticed. He'd kissed her cheek when they arrived together, the obligatory gesture of a man performing marriage for an audience, and then drifted toward his lieutenants before the elevator doors fully opened. Imani had watched him go the way you watch a bus you've missed, with the quiet understanding that this was simply how things were. She told herself she was used to it. She was wrong about that. The evening moved, the way those evenings always moved, too loud, too bright, money splashing around the room disguised as conversation. Imani circulated. She smiled at the right people. She remembered names and wives, and the names of wives and the names of children that the wives had mentioned at previous events. She was, as she had always been, exceptionally good at making other people feel seen. The irony of that was not lost on her. She was standing near the far windows, half listening to the wife of one of Jae-Min's logistics managers talk about a renovation project, when she heard the shift in energy across the room. That particular change in crowd sound laughter getting bigger, more concentrated, that usually meant Jae-Min was holding court. She turned. He was across the room, jacket open, tie loosened just enough to signal that he was relaxed, dominant at ease. Kyung-soo, his head of territorial security, was already red-faced and laughing at something. The actress Song Hae-ra, Imani had heard the name. Everyone in Seoul had heard the name was tucked against Jae-Min's left side with the practiced ease of a woman who understood exactly what her proximity was worth. Imani watched him lean down to say something to Byung-soo. Byung-soo laughed louder. Then Byung-soo said something back, gesturing at the room, at the party, at the general spectacle of wealthy men surrounded by expensive things. Imani couldn't hear the words from where she stood. She could see Jae-Min's expression shift into that particular smile, the one he wore when he was about to say something he thought was clever. She started walking toward the bar, not toward him. Just in that general direction. Because her glass was empty, that was all. She was close enough to hear him when he said it. If this marriage fails. She stopped walking. I'll just find another wife. The room laughed. Song Hai-ra laughed, her hand pressing against Jae-Min's chest in that performance of delight that meant nothing. Byung-soo laughed, clapping another man on the back. Jae-Min laughed hardest of all, because the joke had landed perfectly, because everything he touched landed perfectly, because he was Jae-Min Kwan, and rooms bent themselves to accommodate him. Imani stood 7 feet away with an empty glass in her hand. No one looked at her. Not one person in that room turned to check whether the wife had heard. Not one set of eyes flicked in her direction with apology or discomfort. It was as though she had become part of the furniture, the expensive kind, chosen to match the room, noticed only if it went missing. She set her glass down on a passing tray, quietly, carefully, like she was setting something else down at the same time. She didn't cry, didn't confront him, didn't pull him aside, and hiss at him through a fixed smile the way she'd seen other women do. She simply stood there for a long moment, looking at the man she had loved for 3 years, the man she had reorganized her entire life to stand beside, and felt something move through her chest like a tide going out. Not anger, not even hurt, exactly. Something quieter and more final than either of those things. She went to find her coat. The drive home was silent because she was alone. Jae-Min had his own car, his own driver, his own schedule that would keep him at that party until well past midnight, because men like Jae-Min didn't leave their own celebrations early. Imani sat in the back of a hired car, watching the Incheon harbor lights blur past rain-streaked window, and thought about the white chrysanthemums she'd called the florist to remove that morning. She'd done it for his guests, for his evening, for a party she'd quietly built from the inside, without credit or acknowledgement. She thought about the coffee she'd left beside his files during the overnight negotiation 6 weeks ago, when he'd been awake for 31 hours and running on stubbornness alone. She'd set it without a word because interrupting him felt dangerous in those moments. She'd watched him drink it without looking up, without knowing it was there, almost. She thought about the moment 3 months ago when she'd overheard one of his associates refer to her not cruelly, just casually, the way people are careless when they think they're unobserved as the American wife. Like a title, like a category, not a name. She'd told herself it didn't matter. She'd been lying to herself a lot lately. The car pulled up to the building. She thanked the driver by name because she always learned names. That was who she was, and rode the elevator to the 42nd floor in silence. Their penthouse. She walked through it slowly. She went to the kitchen first. Ran water over her wrists, the way her grandmother had taught her to do when she needed to calm down, when the feelings got too large for the body holding them. Cold water helped, slightly. Then she stood in the center of their bedroom. Their bedroom. The bed he slept in 4 nights out of 7, if that. The closet where her clothes hung alongside suits that cost more than her first car. The nightstand with his reading glasses and the Korean thriller he'd been reading for 5 months. The bookmark never moving. She opened her closet. She pulled out the suitcase from the back, the large one, the one she'd bought before they got married, before Incheon, before all of this. Her suitcase from her life before. She set it on the bed. And then, with the particular calm of someone who has already made a decision they didn't realize they'd been making for months, Imani Caldwell Kwan began to pack. Not everything. She was not taking everything. She took the things that were hers, in the way nothing else in this penthouse was hers. The photographs of her mother, her grandmother, her college friends. The small clay bowl her art school roommate had made her as a graduation gift. 3 books she'd read so many times the spines were soft. The green dress she'd bought for herself with her own money before she'd learned to dress for someone else's preferences. She moved through the closet with quiet efficiency, removing herself from the space, like a woman who had done her calculations and arrived at a final answer. She worked for 2 hours. Her toiletries. Her jewelry, the pieces that had been hers before, not the gifts. Those she left on the dresser in a neat row. Her laptop, her notebooks, the folder of documents she kept in the fireproof box under the bed. She called the car service again. Then she stood at the door of the bedroom and looked at the room one last time. She removed her wedding ring. It was a beautiful ring. She had never denied that. Platinum band, emerald-cut diamond, exactly the kind of ring a man like Jae-Min would choose, impressive, flawless, designed to signal rather than to hold meaning. She had worn it for 3 years. She had looked at it on her hand 10,000 times. She set it on the marble floor just inside the penthouse entrance where he would have to see it the moment he walked in. Not hidden, not left on a surface he might overlook. On the floor, where it would catch him mid-stride. She wanted him to literally stumble over what he'd lost. The car arrived. She left. No note, no call, no dramatic final message. Just gone. The penthouse held its silence around the absence of her, the way rooms do when something important has been removed from them. The photographs on the walls, his photographs, his awards, his framed press features stared at nothing. The refrigerator hummed. The city lights pulsed below, indifferent and bright. 3 hours later, Jae-Min's key turned in the lock. He was still laughing when he came in. Some joke from the elevator, the tail end of a conversation with Byung-soo, the particular good mood of a man who'd spent an evening being admired. He dropped his keys on the side table, reached for his phone to check his messages, and his foot caught on something small. He looked down. The ring caught the light. For a moment, just a moment, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Brain tried to offer explanations. A coin, a button, something fallen from a pocket. Then he understood what it was. He picked it up. Stood there in his own entrance hall, perfectly dressed in his $20,000 suit, holding his wife's wedding ring, and felt something he had not felt in many years. The first cold finger of real fear. Imani. He said it to the empty room. He walked to the bedroom. The closet stood partially open her side, the left side, the organized side, and even from the doorway he could see the gaps. Not emptiness, exactly. She'd left things. The dresses she'd bought here, the shoes, the careful curated wardrobe of a woman who'd been dressing for a role. She'd only taken what was hers before him, which he was realizing was more than he'd noticed. He checked the bathroom, checked the kitchen, moved through the penthouse the way you search a room when you already know what you're not going to find, but your body hasn't caught up to what your mind is telling it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it. No one spoke. Text followed, from the same number. You said you could always find another wife. Now you can. Jae-Min Kwon stood in the center of his 42nd floor penthouse, surrounded by everything that was supposed to prove he had won at life, and read that message 3 times. He called Byung-soo. Find her, he said, my wife. Find out where she went. Byung-soo's paused. Tonight? Tonight, another pause. Boss, it's 2 in the morning. I'm aware of what time it is. The line went quiet for a moment. And in that quiet, Jae-Min heard something he would not have recognized a week ago. Something that only became audible, now that it was missing the particular texture of a life that had been quietly organized around him. Coffee that appeared before he knew he needed it. Calls that were made before he knew there was a problem. The woman who stood at the edge of every room he walked into, not because she had to, but because she had chosen to again and again, every morning for 3 years. He walked to the window. Below him, the city of Incheon glittered the way it always did, relentless and indifferent, blazing with the light of 10,000 lives that had nothing to do with his. He pressed one hand flat against the glass, like he was trying to hold something still. The ring was still in his other hand, closed in his fist. He told himself she would come back. He told himself she'd made her point. He told himself that women like Imani, careful, steady, loyal, didn't just leave. Permanently. Not for real. He told himself all of that. And stood at the window for a long time, looking at a city that had never felt quite so empty, waiting for a callback that would tell him she was somewhere close. She wasn't close. She wasn't coming back, but that truth would take him a long time yet to fully understand. And the man Jae-Min Kwon would have to become to finally face it? That man didn't exist yet. He was still buried under 36 years of pride and power, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that everything valuable in his world could be replaced. He just needed to lose enough to find out how wrong he was. Byung-soo called back at 4:17 in the morning. Jae-Min was still awake. He hadn't tried to sleep. He'd sat in the living room with every light on, the way children do when they're afraid of the dark but won't admit it, working through a bottle of scotch that he'd barely touched. The ring sat on the coffee table in front of him. He kept looking at it the way you look at something you don't fully understand yet, with the particular attention of a man trying to read a language he doesn't speak. "She's not in the city," Byung-soo said, without preamble. "What do you mean she's not in the city?" "I mean she's gone, boss. Her phone is off. No credit card activity since yesterday afternoon. She withdrew cash, a significant amount 3 days ago." "Planned this." Jae-Min was quiet for a moment. 3 days ago. Yes, 3 days ago he had been in Busan's for a meeting. 3 days ago she had been in their penthouse, going about her mornings with the same quiet efficiency she always had, making phone calls, organizing whatever she organized, being the woman he barely noticed, and at some point during that ordinary Tuesday, she had walked into a bank and withdrawn enough cash to disappear. 3 days ago, she had already decided. "She has family in the States," Jae-Min said. "Start there. I already have someone checking." But boss, a pause. The kind of pause Byung-soo used when he was about to say something he wasn't sure he should say. "If she doesn't want to be found, I didn't ask for your opinion on whether she wants to be found." The line went quiet. "Yes, boss." Jae-Min hung up and looked at the ring on the table and thought, with a cold and unfamiliar clarity, that this was the first time in 11 years that someone had left before he told them to. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on his side of the bed, his side, which he had always considered the entire bed, if he was honest, and stared at the ceiling, and waited for morning to come and bring him something useful to do with the anger that was building steadily behind his sternum, hot and pressurized, looking for somewhere to go. By morning, he had decided she would come back on her own. He just needed to wait her out. He was wrong about that, but it took him several weeks to accept it. The first week, he told himself she needed space. He was even somewhat generous about it. Privately, he could acknowledge, in the unguarded hours before dawn, that the comment at the party had been careless. Not wrong, not exactly, because he did believe he could find another wife, if it came to that, but careless. Poorly timed. He'd said a private thought out loud in a public room, and she'd taken it harder than he'd intended. He would give her a week. She didn't call. The second week, he had Byung-soo's contact at the airport authority pull travel records. She'd flown out 36 hours after she left the penthouse, an economy seat on a commercial flight economy, which meant something, though he couldn't articulate exactly what, to Atlanta, where her mother's side of the family lived. The information made him feel better for approximately 1 hour. She was with her family. She was safe. She was probably talking to her mother about him right now, and her mother was probably telling her to call him, and this would resolve itself. Her mother had never particularly liked him. He decided not to think about that. The third week, he stopped waiting and started working, which was his version of managing grief, though he would never have called it grief. He scheduled back-to-back meetings. He took calls at midnight. He pushed 3 separate deals through phases. They'd been stalled in for months, operating on the compressed and slightly reckless energy of a man who is trying to outrun something that moves at the same speed he does. It was during this period that he made the first mistake. Song Hae-ra had texted him twice since the party. The second text was direct enough that he couldn't claim to misunderstand it. The subtle circumstances. Under normal circumstances, he would have handled it with the smooth indifference he applied to most complicated his life, a polite deflection, a closed door. He had always been, whatever else he was, careful about that particular category of chaos. But normal circumstances had left with Imani's wedding ring. He texted back. Song Hae-ra arrived at the penthouse on a Thursday evening with a bottle of Japanese whiskey and the confident ease of a woman who had never been told no by anyone she found worth asking. She was beautiful in the architectural way of women who have invested significantly in being beautiful, precise, maintained, expensive. kissed him the way someone claims territory. For about 40 minutes, Jae-Min felt almost like himself again. Then she said, "Show me where the good glasses are," and he pointed her toward the kitchen, and she opened 3 cabinets before finding them, and in the silence of watching her search, through his own kitchen, his kitchen, where Imani had known without thinking where everything lived. Something in his chest went slightly wrong. He didn't say anything. Song Hae-ra poured 2 glasses and handed him one, and smiled and said, "So this is the famous penthouse. You've heard about it? Everyone's heard about it." She looked around with the assessing gaze of someone calculating real estate. "It's bigger than I expected. Cold, though. Doesn't feel like anyone lives here." Jae-Min drank his whiskey and said nothing because she was more right than he wanted to acknowledge. She stayed 3 days. By the end of the first day, he understood that having her there was not, in any way, the same as not being alone. She talked constantly in the bright and frictionless way of someone who had learned that sound space and space makes people uncomfortable. She left things everywhere: shoes in the hallway, products across the bathroom counter, a specific brand of sparkling water that appeared in his refrigerator without his knowledge or consent. She slept diagonally across the bed and woke late and made no coffee because she didn't drink coffee, and it apparently didn't occur to her that he did. He made his own coffee on the second morning, standing in his kitchen in yesterday's shirt, and the small mechanical humiliation of it, the measuring, the waiting, the fact that he had to look up how long the specific machine took because he had never once operated it himself, moved through him like a kind of low current. Imani had never not had coffee ready. He had never once wondered how it got there. On the 3rd day, Song Hae-ra found his private office unlocked and wandered in looking for him, and he came out of the bathroom to find her standing at his desk, looking at the papers laid across it with the bright and slightly unfocused curiosity of someone who doesn't understand what they're seeing, but is interested in it anyway. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. "What are you doing in here?" he said. Not a question. She turned, unbothered. "Looking for you." "What is all this?" "This room is off limits." "You didn't say that." "I'm saying it now." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that recalibrated slightly, the social calculation happening behind her eyes, adjusting. Then she smiled, easy and unruffled, and walked toward him. "You're very serious for someone on a Thursday." He caught her wrist before she reached him, gently but firmly enough that she stopped. "Go pack your things," he said. Smile thinned. "Excuse me? I have meetings tomorrow." "You should go home tonight." The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which was long enough for both of them to understand what was actually being said. "I see," she said. She packed. She was efficient about it, and cold, the warmth of the previous 3 days snapping off like a light switch. At the door, she turned with her bag over her shoulder and looked at him with an expression that was part contempt and part something almost like pity. "Whoever she is," Song Hae-ra said, "she's got more power over you than I think you realize." The door closed. Jae-Min stood in the hallway alone and thought, "I don't know what you're talking about," and knew, with the particular self-awareness that comes to men at 2 in the morning in empty rooms, that he was lying to himself. The replacements came in waves after that, each one teaching him something he hadn't expected to learn. There was a socialite daughter of a shipping family, appropriate connections, exactly the kind of woman who would have made sense on paper. She was charming at parties and spectacular at spending money, and completely, entirely uninterested in the texture of his actual life. When he mentioned a problem with one of his distribution contracts, she looked at him the way people look at someone who has started speaking another language. Not unkind, just elsewhere. Imani would have said, "Walk me through it." And then she would have listened, and she wouldn't have understood all of it, but she would have asked the right question at the right moment, the question that sometimes shook something loose in his thinking. He'd never told her she was useful that way. He'd never thought to. There was a model who was 24 and who existed in the way very beautiful 24-year-olds sometimes do, at a slight remove from the practical world, orbiting a reality slightly adjacent to everyone else's. She was not unkind. She was simply not there in any way that mattered. When he had a nightmare, he was having them more frequently, though he would not have admitted this under any circumstances. She slept through it. Imani used to put her hand on his back. She never woke him, never made it into something requiring discussion. Just her hand, weight and warmth, present. He hadn't realized he'd needed that until it stopped. The model left her things in the bathroom for a week after she stopped coming around. He finally had the housekeeper box them up, and the housekeeper, a woman in her 60s who had worked for him for 4 years and had never once offered an opinion, looked at the collection of products on the counter and said, very quietly, almost to herself, "It's a lot of different people in one space." Jae-Min looked at her. She kept her eyes on what she was packing. He went back to work. The problems started bleeding into the work by the 7th week. It wasn't dramatic at first. A meeting he arrived at, slightly underprepared, because no one had flagged a scheduling conflict, a conflict that, he only realized later, Imani had been quietly managing for at least 2 years, because 2 of his regular attendees genuinely hated each other and needed to be positioned on opposite sides of the table with enough buffer between them that things stayed civil. He hadn't known there was a system. Without the system, the meeting ran off the rails in the first 20 minutes when the 2 men got into a territorial argument over a logistics point that became, very quickly, not about logistics at all. Jae-Min had to physically stand up and put his hand on the table to shut it down. He was furious afterward, and he directed most of the fury at Byung-soo, which was unfair, and Byung-soo absorbed it with the patient stillness of a man who has been doing this for a long time. The seating arrangement, Byung-soo said carefully. "What about it? It's always been arranged in a specific way. I assumed someone was still—" He stopped. Jae-Min stared at him. "Still what?" Byung-soo said nothing. "Still what, Byung-soo?" "Nothing, boss. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Jae-Min knew what the end of that sentence was. He left the room before he had to hear anyone say it out loud. The second problem was his wardrobe, which sounds small until you understand that in his world, appearance was not vanity but strategy. The dry cleaning service, his specific dry cleaning service, the one that handled the particular fabrics of his suits without destroying them, had been managed through a standing account that Imani had set up with specific instructions years ago. When the account lapsed without renewal, no one noticed. He showed up to a summit meeting in Daejeon wearing a suit that had been cleaned by a different service, and the collar was slightly wrong, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but wrong in the way that people who spend their lives around expensive clothing notice immediately. He saw one of the senior bosses glance at his collar. Just once. It was a nothing moment. It was a moment that cost him $200 and a dry cleaning account. But in the geometry of power that defined his world, it was the kind of detail that compounded. Then came the money. Not a large amount. In the scheme of things, a watch, a bracelet, a specific pair of earrings that appeared in a social media photograph 3 days after the woman who'd taken them had left his residence and stopped answering his calls. He had Byung-soo recover the items, quietly and without escalation, because the alternative, making it a public thing, was worse. But the recovery cost a favor, and the favor cost him a position, in a conversation he needed to be neutral in, and the neutrality cost him leverage. He had never had to spend leverage on this category of problem before. She was in the bedroom, Byung-soo said, the safe room. She had the combination, I know. He'd given it to her. He'd given it to her because he'd trusted her, and he trusted her because he was lonely and said yes to things without thinking. I know. Just fix it. It's fixed. Then why are you still standing here? Byung-soo stayed standing. Because there's something else. Jae-Min looked at him. Byung-soo's face was in neutral, but there was something in his posture, a particular quality of stillness, that meant the news was bad enough that he was managing his own body language while he delivered it. Seo-jin. Byung-soo named one of the 3 men who formed the innermost ring of Jae-Min's security detail. I found him this afternoon in your secondary residence. With the woman from the latte event, Jae-Min went very still. Byung-soo continued, steady and flat. They've been meeting there for 6 weeks. She had a key because you gave her access 3 weeks ago. He had access because he's your security. The silence in the room had a particular quality to it, dense, like water at depth. Where is he now? Jae-Min said. I have him and her. I have her contact information. Jae-Min stood up slowly from his chair, the way men do when they're controlling something that wants to move very fast and very loud. He walked to the window. He stood there for about 30 seconds, looking at nothing, breathing through his nose. "Remove them both," he said. "Seo Jin gets nothing. Not a severance, not a reference, not a conversation. He's gone by tonight. Yes. The woman, she keeps what she was given. I don't want it back. I want her out of my contact list and out of this building, and I want it done without a scene." "Understood." And Byung-soo, "Boss, how long have you known?" Pause. "A real one, not the strategic kind." 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I was verifying before I brought it to you. I wanted to be certain. Jae-Min nodded once, still looking at the window. "Fine. Go." Byung-soo left. Jae-Min stood at the window for a long time after the door closed. Outside, the harbor moved with its usual indifferent rhythm ships and lights and the cold gray water that didn't care what happened in the towers above it. He was thinking about something Imani had said once, about 9 months into their marriage. They'd been having one of those circular arguments that didn't really have a point, the kind that are really about something else, and she'd stopped mid-sentence and looked at him with an expression he hadn't been able to read and said, "The people around you, Jae-Min, do you know which ones actually see you? Or just what you can give them?" He'd told her she was being dramatic. He thought about that now. He thought about the 7 men in his innermost security rotation and tried to count how many of them he could actually read, really read, past the professional loyalty performance, down to what was actually in their chests. He got to 3 before he became uncertain. He sat back down at his desk. He hadn't eaten since this morning. He realized it now. The way you realize things when the adrenaline goes dully, from a distance, the body sending a low-priority message. Imani used to notice when he hadn't eaten, in a way that somehow bypassed being mothering. She'd just place something beside him. A plate, a bowl. Not a fuss, not a comment, just there. He picked up his phone and called room service from the building's restaurant, something he hadn't done before, because he'd never needed to, and sat on hold for 4 minutes, while some automated system routed him through options. And by the time a human being answered, he had lost his appetite entirely. He hung up. He sat in the silence of the empty penthouse and thought about the shape of the past 2 months, the chaotic parties, the women who wanted his wallet and ignored his face, the stolen watches, the disloyal bodyguard, the meeting that fell apart, the suit collar, the dry cleaning account, the daily small mechanics of a life coming gradually but undeniably apart at its seams. All of it was things Imani had been quietly holding. He had called it her being around. He had thought of it, when he thought of it at all, as the natural byproduct of a woman with time on her hands, and a comfortable life to fill. He had not once, in 3 years, applied the word partnership to what she was doing. He opened the locked drawer in his desk. Her wedding ring sat inside, in the same spot he'd placed it the night she left, on top of an old contract, slightly off-center, catching the desk lamp's light. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something that has started to mean more than it did when you put it there. Then his phone rang. It was his attorney. "I need you to sit down." The attorney said, which was never, in Jae-Min's experience, the beginning of a good sentence. "I'm sitting. We've received formal notification from an American legal firm. 3 partners. They represent a client who has initiated proceedings for dissolution of marriage under international jurisdiction clauses." A pause. "The filing is comprehensive. Whoever put this together, they know what they're doing. Asset declarations, jurisdictional frameworks, the works. It's not a threat, boss. It's a finalized action." Jae-Min heard every word. He understood every word. "Send me the documents." He said, "I'm sending them now." He hung up. He looked at the ring in the drawer. He thought about a woman in economy class, flying 12 hours with a plan she'd had in place for at least 3 days before she used it, carrying only what had been hers before him, leaving behind a ring on a marble floor, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd finally finished writing. Not a woman who had left on impulse. Not a woman who needed him to wait her out. A woman who had planned, who had withdrawn cash, who had hired 3 attorneys in another country, who had been, all this time, completely clear about what she was doing, even when he had refused to understand it. The documents landed in his email. He opened them. The divorce filing was 47 pages. Every asset, every account, every jurisdictional layer of their marriage, laid out with the cool precision of people who were very good at their jobs and had been given every necessary detail to work with. At the bottom of the cover letters, there was a single handwritten note, scanned and attached as the last page. The handwriting was hers. When you're ready to marry again, the paperwork will be finalized. Good luck. Jae-Min read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the desk, slowly, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady. He looked at the ring. He looked at the documents. He looked at the window and the city beyond it, and the harbor with its cold water and its moving ships, and for the first time in a very long time, Jae-Min Kwan had no next move. No strategy, no leverage to apply, no person to call, no resource to throw at the problem until it resolved itself in his favor. There was only the ring and the 47 pages. And Syndicate Summit in 4 days, where every significant rival he had ever made would be in the same room, watching him the way subs watch something that has started to limp. He had 4 days to become the man he used to be. He already knew, in some part of himself he didn't have words for, that the man he used to be was not coming back. What came instead, in the silence of that ruined evening, was something he hadn't felt since he was a young man with nothing, the cold and clarifying sensation of having run completely out of road. Closed the drawer. He picked up his phone. He called Byung-soo. Somebody said, brief me. Everything. Every position. Every faction. Every man who's been talking about me since she left. I want to know all of it before I walk into that room. Byung-soo was quiet for half a second. How much of it do you actually want to hear? All of it. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, boss, Byung-soo said. And his voice, for the first time in 11 years of working for Jae-Min Kwan, carried something that sounded almost like grief. The briefing lasted 4 hours. Byung-soo sat across from him at the desk with a single notepad and no digital devices, because some conversations weren't meant to exist on any server, anywhere, and went through it the way a doctor goes through a diagnosis, methodically, without softening the language, letting the numbers and names land where they landed. It was worse than Jae-Min had expected. Not catastrophically worse. Not yet. But the kind of worse that becomes catastrophic if you wait another 90 days, which was the timeline Byung-soo laid out with the calm precision of a man who had been watching the walls move inward for weeks and hadn't known how to say so. Daeunbaek, Byung-soo said, he's been making calls. Nothing open, nothing that can be directly attributed. But he's been talking to the Busan faction, and the Busan faction has been talking to 3 of the independent corridor operators in the north. And those conversations are happening in rooms where your name comes up, and the tone is not what it used to be. What's the tone? Careful. The tone is careful, which in that context means exploratory. Jae-Min understood what exploratory meant. It meant people were asking questions about what the landscape looked like without him in it. Not planning yet, just looking. What else? The quarterly summit in 4 days. Baek has requested a procedural item on the agenda. Territory review. Specifically, the Eastern Distribution Corridor, the one you consolidated 18 months ago. That corridor is settled. He's arguing it wasn't settled. It was suspended pending a formal vote that never happened. That's not accurate. I know it's not accurate. Byung-soo met his eyes. But he's not arguing accuracy. He's arguing procedure. And 4 of the 7 voting bloc leaders are willing to hear it. Jae-Min was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the harbor was doing what it always did, indifferent and vast, the lights of container ships moving with geological slowness across the dark water. 4 of 7, he said. 4 of 7. Who? Byung-soo named them. Jae-Min knew all 4. 2 of them he would have sworn 6 months ago were unconditional allies. One of them had eaten dinner at this table, had complimented the food, had shaken his hand at the end of the evening and said, in the particular way of men in their world, that it was good to have someone reliable at the center. Kim Jun-ho, Jae-Min said yes. He was here in March. I know, he ate at my table. Byung-soo said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Jae-Min leaned back in his chair and pressed two fingers against the bridge of his nose and sat there for a long moment with his eyes closed, running through the geometry of it. 4 of 7 meant Bake had a strong play but not a guaranteed one. It meant the summit room would be a pressure test. It meant that every crack in Jae-Min's surface, the exhaustion, the disheveled weeks, the rumors about the women and the stolen watches and the bodyguard, all of it would be read and catalogued by men who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. You should know, Byung-soo said, more quietly, that the rumors have been louder than I reported. Jae-Min opened his eyes. I didn't tell you the full scope because Byung-soo paused, choosing his words. Because some of it was unverified, and I didn't want to bring you noise. But in retrospect, tell me now, Byung-soo told him. The story had moved through the circuit, the way stories do in their world, distorted by each retelling, accumulating detail that may or may not have been real, but functioning as truth because enough people had repeated it. The version circulating now had Jae-Min coming apart in stages, the women, the disloyal bodyguard, the disorganized meetings. Someone had added, somewhere in the chain, that he'd been drinking heavily. Someone else had added that he'd missed a payment on a northern contract, which was not true but had been repeated often enough to develop its own momentum. Who started it, Jae-Min said. I don't know for certain. But the origin point seems to be a pause. Sojin. The bodyguard. The one he'd removed without severance 8 days ago. He talked. He talked. Byung-soo's voice carried no editorializing, but his jaw was tight. To people who talk to Bake's circle, the timeline fits. Jae-Min absorbed this. Seo-jin, a man who had stood at his door, who had been inside his private residence, who had known the rhythms and schedules and vulnerabilities of his life in the specific way that only people allowed very close can know them. He'd fired him with a door slam and no severance, and apparently not enough consideration for what that man knew and who he might call afterward. Another miscalculation. Another thing Imani would never have let happen, because Imani understood, in her quiet and precise way, that every person you dismissed without care became a person with nothing to lose. He had learned that lesson from her absence too late. Get me into the room early, Jae-Min said. Summit opens at 10. I want to be there at 8. I want to read every man when they walk in before they've had time to arrange their faces. I'll arrange it. And Byung-soo, boss. The 4 who've moved to Bake's position, I want to talk to them individually before the session starts. Not as a group, one at a time. He thought for a moment. Offer nothing. Just talk. I want to see how they look at me when it's just us. Byung-soo nodded, wrote something on his notepad, and stood. At the door, he stopped with his hand on the frame. You're going to walk into that room, he said, and it's going to be different from every time before. I know. I mean, he seemed to be searching for the specific shape of what he meant. Before, when you walked in, people were watching you to see what you'd do, to learn from it or to stay out of the way of it. Now some of them are watching you to see if you'll stumble. I know it's different. Do you know how to walk in like nothing changed? Jae-Min looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. But I'm going to do it anyway. Byung-soo held his gaze. Then he nodded once, stepped out, and closed the door. Jae-Min sat alone in the silence of his office, with the ring in the locked drawer and the divorce papers in his email, and 4 days until the most important room he'd walked into in 11 years, and thought about what it meant to hold a position when the ground under it had started to shift. He thought about it for a very long time. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, made coffee correctly on the 3rd try, and started working. The summit was held at a private property 40 minutes outside Incheon, a converted estate that belonged to no one person for liability purposes, but that everyone in the room understood to be neutral ground. Stones walls, old trees, rooms that had witnessed 30 years of conversations that were never written down. Jae-Min had been coming here since he was 29 years old, first as the youngest man in the room, and eventually as the man the room organized itself around. He arrived at 7:58. The estate staff showed no visible reaction to his early arrival. They had been working these summits for decades and had absorbed a professional blankness that made them nearly invisible, which was exactly what they were paid for. He was shown to the main meeting room, long oak table, 12 chairs, windows overlooking a garden that was beautiful and meant nothing, and he stood at the head of it alone for a few minutes. He put his hands on the back of his chair. He looked at the room. Then he walked to the window and stood there, very still, watching the garden, until he heard the first car on the gravel outside. The individual meetings happened in a side room before the session, as Buyong-soo had arranged. 3 of the 4 came. The 4th sent an aide with an apology about a delayed car, which was either true or a deliberate signal. Jae-Min filed both possibilities and moved on. The 3 who came were interesting in different ways. Park's Sung-woo, who ran Western Corridor operations and had known Jae-Min for 8 years, sat across from him in the side room, with the practiced ease of a man who was comfortable in his own body and had nothing to prove. He didn't fidget. He met Jae-Min's eyes cleanly. When Jae-Min talked about the upcoming session, Park listened without interrupting, which was either respect or a very sophisticated performance of it. The corridor question, Park said when Jae-Min finished. Baek is pushing it hard. I know he is. He's calling it a procedural correction. Most people in the room know it's a power test. Do you know it? Yes, and where are you? Park was quiet for a moment, not evasive, genuinely thinking, which Jae-Min respected, even now. I'm where I've always been, Park said. I work with the person who keeps the center solid. The center's been less solid lately. The center is solid. I want to believe that. Park's voice was neutral, not unkind. Come into that room today and show me. The second man, Oh Chang-seok, was younger, 41, aggressive, built his position through the kind of relentless forward momentum that Jae-Min recognized because he'd had it once himself. Oh sat at the edge of his chair the whole time, forward-leaning, the physical posture of someone for whom sitting still is a concession. When Jae-Min laid out his position on the corridor, Oh nodded once. You know what people have been saying, Oh said. I know what some people have been saying. Do you want to address it? Is there something specific you heard that concerns you? Oh smiled thinly. That you're distracted. That the operation since... He paused, choosing with surgical care. Since recent months has been running on momentum from before. That the decision-making has been slower. That you've been... He stopped again. Finish it, Jae-Min said. That you've been spending your attention on personal problems, and the work has been on autopilot. The room was very quiet. Jae-Min looked at Oh Chang-seok and felt the anger move through him in a clean wave, real anger, the kind that sharpens rather than clouds, and then let it pass. The work has not been on autopilot, he said. His voice was level. The last 3 months I pushed the Daejeon contract through a phase it's been stalled in for 2 years. I consolidated the northern access point that the Busan faction had been contesting for 5 years. I did both of those things in the window you're describing as distracted. You can look at the numbers. Oh held his gaze. I have looked at the numbers. Then you know the numbers don't say what the rumors say. The numbers are one thing. Oh leaned back slightly, just slightly. The room reads something else. The room reads what people with an interest in a certain outcome want it to read, Jae-Min said. You're smart enough to know the difference. Oh looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his posture, small, but Jae-Min caught it. Come in strong today, Oh said. That's all I'm saying. The third meeting was shorter and worse. Lee Myung-jae was 63, the oldest active boss in the room, a man who had survived in this business by the particular genius of never being clearly on the wrong side of anything. He sat across from Jae-Min with his hands folded on the table and his face in complete professional neutral, and listened to everything Jae-Min said, with the focused patience of someone who has already made his decision and is simply being polite about it. When Jae-Min finished, Lee nodded slowly. You're healthy, Lee said. It wasn't really a question. I'm fine. You look tired. I didn't sleep well. Lee unfolded his hands and refolded them the other way. Corridor issue, it's going to come to a vote today. I know. Baek has the numbers he needs. He said it simply, without relish. Jae-Min went very still. You're telling me you've already counted. I'm telling you what the room will look like when you walk in. Lee's voice was not unkind. It was worse than unkind, it was honest. The fourth man who didn't come to your meeting this morning, he's already committed. That's 4. You need 6 to block it. You have 4 in your column as of last night, which means the vote is 4-4, with 4 genuinely undecided. That's winnable. It's winnable. Lee paused. If you come in today and you look like the man they remember, not the man they've been hearing about for 3 months. And if I don't? Lee looked at him with the steady, tired eyes of someone who has watched powerful men fall and never found it entertaining. Then the corridor goes to a joint oversight committee, and Bake controls 3 of the 5 committee seats, and you know exactly what that means for your Eastern operations over the next 18 months. Jae-Min stood up. Lee stood with him, old reflex of respect. I'll give you a piece of information you didn't ask for, Lee said at the door. Free. Go ahead. The rumors about you, the drinking, the missing payment, all of it. The missing payment story specifically. I had someone trace it. His eyes were careful. It came from inside your organization, not from the bodyguard you let go. Jae-Min stopped. The bodyguard fed the other stories, Lee said. But the payment story, the one that's done the most damage, because it makes you look financially unstable, that one came from someone who was in your inner operation. Someone who had access to the kind of detail that makes a false story sound credible. The silence was absolute. You're saying I have a second leak. I'm saying the source had to be close to you. Lee opened the door himself. I'm saying you should think carefully about who was in the room when the quarterly numbers were discussed, and who might have found something to gain from a certain set of changes in the summit's outcome. He left. Jae-Min stood alone in the side room, the quarterly numbers meeting. 8 weeks ago, before the summit was even on the schedule, before the Beck challenge was formalized. A small room, a tight circle Byung-soo, 2 financial managers, and Min Jae, who handled the Northern Territory accounts and had been with the organization for 6 years and had sat in that meeting talking about numbers that only 3 or 4 people in the world were supposed to know. He walked into the main meeting room. He took his seat at the head of the table. He sat there, perfectly still, and watched 12 powerful men file in and arrange themselves around the oak table, some of them meeting his eyes and some of them not. And he looked at each face the way you look at something you thought you understood and are now reading again from the beginning. The session opened. Baek's procedural item came 40 minutes in. Dae-Hyun Baek was 60, solidly built in the way of men, who were physical before they were powerful, with a face that communicated warmth at a distance and revealed nothing closer up. He presented the corridor challenge in the practice language of procedural legitimacy, the vote question, the technical argument, the framing of himself as a man simply seeking clarity. It was well done. Let him finish. Let the room absorb it. Then he spoke, and he spoke for 11 minutes, not long, not an overreach, but specific and grounded and clean. He hit the numbers Lee had said were there. He addressed the procedural question directly and dismantled it on its own terms. He looked at the undecided 4, and he said without saying it, that the man in this chair is still the man in this chair. He could feel the room listening the way it used to. For a moment, a real one, not a performance. He thought he had it. Then the doors opened. A courier, young, visibly uncomfortable, escorted by 2 of the estate's security staff, who looked like they would rather be doing literally anything else. The courier walked the full length of the room, with every set of eyes tracking him, placed a thick envelope directly in front of Jae-Min, and stepped back. The room was absolutely, completely silent. Jae-Min looked at the envelope. His name was on it, his full legal name, in the precise lettering of a legal document. Return address, a law firm in Atlanta, Georgia. He knew what it was before he opened it. He opened it anyway, because showing weakness at that table was worse than whatever was inside. Papers were 47 pages, organized into tabbed sections, with every signature finalized and every filing date stamped and every legal formality completed with the precise thoroughness of attorneys who were very good and had been briefed thoroughly. Cover sheet said, "Final decree of dissolution of marriage," and attached, paperclipped to the inside cover, was a handwritten note on plain white paper. "Now you're officially free to marry again. Good luck." Dae-Hyun Baek, sitting 3 seats to his left, read the cover page upside down. He had been in this business long enough and was seated close enough and was exactly the kind of man who read things upside down. His face didn't change, and then he laughed. It started low, a single exhale through the nose, almost private. And then it became a sound, and the man beside him glanced over and saw what was on the table and joined it. And it moved around the room the way laughter does, when powerful men sense that something has shifted and want to be on the right side of the shift. Within 30 seconds, half the room was laughing. Not all of them. Park Sung-woo was not laughing. Lee Myung-jae was not laughing. Oh Chang-seok was looking at the table. But the laughter that was happening was loud enough to fill every silence in the room, and it crashed over Jae-Min like water, and he sat at the head of the table, completely motionless, the divorce papers in front of him, and for the first time understood with a physical, full-body understanding that no amount of intelligence could have delivered to him any other way exactly what Imani had felt 7 feet from him at that party. The exposure of it, the public, unavoidable, nowhere-to-look exposure of being reduced in a room full of people who will not stop laughing long enough to see you. He had done this to her. He sat there and let the laughter run its course. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things his body was screaming at him to do. He sat in it, and it lasted a very long time. And when it finally thinned and the room began to realign itself, and people remembered that he was still at the head of the table, Jae-Min Kwon stood up. He gathered the divorce papers. He straightened them against the table surface, with 2 precise controlled movements. He looked at Dae-yoon Baek. Baek met his eyes with the settled confidence of a man who feels a win coming. "We'll table the quarter question to the next session," Jae-Min said. His voice was level, not loudly, just there in the room, taking up the space it had always taken up. "I have business to attend to," he walked out. No threats. No slam door. No dramatic exit line, just out. And the room he left behind was quieter than it expected to be, because men who have watched someone break tend to know what breaking sounds like, and this hadn't sounded like that. It had sounded like something else, something that made 3 people at that table glance at each other with an expression that wasn't quite victory. Byung-soo caught up with him in the hallway. "Boss." "Not here." They walked outside. The garden was cold and gray and smelled like earth and old stone. Jae-Min walked to the far end of it, away from the windows, and stopped. "It was Min-jae," he said. Byung-soo went very still beside him. The payment story, the leak from inside. It was Min-jae. He turned to look at Byung-soo directly. "Tell me I'm wrong." Byung-soo's silence was a full second longer than it should have been. "I had suspicions," Byung-soo said. "I was building confirmation before I brought it to you. You knew I suspected for 3 weeks. Jae-Min looked at him. The man who had been his right side for 11 years. Who had sat across from him 4 days ago and delivered a briefing that was almost complete, almost honest, almost everything, except for the single name at the center of it. 3 weeks, Jae-Min said. Byung-soo's jaw worked. "I didn't want to bring you a name without proof. Not with everything else happening. Not with the summit coming and you already, not with me already what? Already compromised." The word landed hard. Byung-soo said it without flinching, which was either courage or desperation. "You haven't been making clean decisions. I've been watching you make 3/4 decisions for 2 months, boss. I was trying to protect you from pulling a trigger on the wrong person because the right information came to you at the wrong time." Jae-Min stood in the cold garden and let the words settle. Byung-soo was not wrong. That was the part that made it land with the particular force that did not the betrayal of the withheld information, but the reason for it. Because Byung-soo had been trying to manage him, had looked at Jae-Min Kwon and seen a man who needed to be managed carefully, like a loaded weapon with a compromised safety mechanism. Jae-Min had become the thing he had spent his entire life, making sure other people never became around him unpredictable in the wrong direction. "Where is Min-jae now?" he said, "in the city. His residence." "Bring him in. Quietly. Tonight," he paused. "Not to the penthouse. The secondary office." Byung-soo nodded. And Byung-soo, he turned to face him fully. The next time you have a name I need to hear, and you decide I'm not ready to hear it, you come to me anyway. You let me decide what I'm ready for. You understand? Yes, boss. That's the last time I say it. Understood. They stood in the garden for a moment longer. The wind moved through the old trees, and somewhere on the other side of the state wall, a car started. Jae-Min looked at the stone wall, at the bare branches of the trees above it, at the gray sky that sat on top of everything like a lid. He had come into this summit with 4 days of preparation and the intent to walk in as the man he used to be. What he'd walked out with instead was a finalized divorce, a room full of men who had just watched him be publicly humiliated, the knowledge that a 6-year member of his inner circle had been feeding strategic intelligence to his primary rival, and the confirmation that his most loyal lieutenant had been quietly managing his judgment for months out of a concern that was he had to sit with this not entirely unreasonable. He reached into his jacket pocket. His hand found the small weight of the ring. He'd started carrying it without quite deciding to, the way you carry something you can't bring yourself to put down. He held it in his closed fist for a moment, standing in that cold garden, and thought about a woman on the other side of the ocean who had sent 47 pages and a handwritten note and whose handwriting he had recognized across a table full of watching men before he'd even fully registered what the papers were. He thought about what Lee Myung-jae had said, "Come in today and look like the man they remember." He had come in looking like that man, and the room had still laughed. Because the man they remembered was built on a foundation that had been there so long and so quietly that he'd never once thought to look at what it was made of, or who had been laying. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. Jae-Min sat in the back of the car with the divorce papers on the seat beside him and said nothing for the entire ride. His driver, a man named Chul, who had been driving him for 7 years, and understood that silence was sometimes the only appropriate response to a man's face, kept his eyes forward and his hands at 10 and 2 and did not once glance in the rearview mirror. Jae-Min looked out the window. The countryside moved past in the gray November light, bare fields, industrial outskirts, the gradual thickening of the city as they closed the distance. He watched it without seeing it. His mind was running through the summit room in loops, replaying the specific sequence of it, his 11 minutes of clean argument, the room coming back toward him, the feeling that he had it, and then the doors opening, and the courier walking, and the laughter spreading from back's corner like a match dropped in dry grass. He'd walked out of that room intact on the surface. He knew what the inside looked like. The car stopped in traffic. He looked at the ring in his palm. He'd been holding it since the garden and hadn't put it down. The platinum had gone warm from his skin. He closed his fingers around it and felt the slight pressure of the edges against his palm and thought, with a clarity that felt almost surgical, that he had spent 3 years married to a woman who understood the architecture of his world better than almost anyone in that summit room, and he had treated that understanding like ambient noise. She had known. She had always known which allies were real, which problems were building below the surface, which men at his table were performing loyalty, and which ones were actually there. He could see it now. Looking back, the number of times her quiet comment at the end of a long evening had redirected something he was about to get wrong. He'd called it her being perceptive. He'd meant it as a compliment. He hadn't understood that it was expertise developed and applied every single day by a woman who had made his world her serious study because she loved him enough to. Traffic moved. The city closed around the car. His phone buzzed twice. Sex Young-soo, confirming that Jae had been located and would be brought in by 8 o'clock. Jae-Min read the message and put the phone back in his pocket without responding. He needed to think before he saw Min-jae. He needed to be very, very precise about what he did next. Because the problem with the last 3 months was not merely that he'd made mistakes. It was that he'd been making emotional mistakes dressed as strategic ones, pushing decisions through the wrong part of his brain, part that was raw and offended and running on insufficient sleep, and the particular grinding hollowness of a man who kept reaching for something that wasn't there. He would not do that tonight. Tonight he needed to be cold. Not angry, not humiliated, cold. He pulled out the divorce papers and read them again from the beginning. Not because there was new information in them, because reading them carefully, the way they deserved to be read, was a form of respect for the woman who had commissioned them. And he owed her that at minimum. He read all 47 pages in the 40 remaining minutes of the drive. By the time the car stopped in front of his building, he had a plan. Min-jae was brought in at 7:43, not 8 o'clock, which meant either Byung-soo had applied pressure or Min-jae had come without resistance, which was itself information. Men who run tend to run immediately. Men who cooperate tend to believe they can still talk their way through something. The secretary office was a floor below the penthouse, a workspace Jae-Min used for conversations that didn't belong in the main building's meeting rooms, with no staff, no camera, and an elevator that required a key that exactly 4 people possessed. The room had 2 chairs facing each other across a low table, a single lamp, and a window that looked at a concrete wall. It was designed to feel like the end of a road, because sometimes that was what it needed to be. Min-jae was 38 years old, slight-framed, with the kind of face that read, as younger than it was open, adaptable. The face of a man who had made himself useful by being readable in exactly the way he wanted to be read. He had been in Jae-Min's Northern Territory operation for 6 years. He had sat at the quarterly numbers meeting 8 weeks ago with a notepad and a pen and a posture that communicated total focus and absolute loyalty. He was sitting in one of the 2 chairs when Jae-Min came in. He stood up when the door opened. Old reflex. Jae-Min gestured for him to sit back down. He sat in the other chair himself, not behind a desk across a table at the same level, 2 feet of distance between them. Min-jae's hands were on his knees. His jaw was set in the practiced neutral of a man managing his own fear by watching his own face. Jae-Min looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Min-jae held the eye contact for about 5 seconds. Then his gaze dropped to the table, came back up, dropped again. "You know why you're here," Jae-Min said. "Not a question." Min-jae heard the distinction. He stopped, restarted. "I have some idea. Tell me your idea." Min-jae's hands tightened on his knees. "Payment story. The rumor about the Northern contract. Where did it come from?" A long silence. "Me," Min-jae said. The word sat in the room like something that had been dropped from a height. Jae-Min didn't move, didn't react, just sat with his hands loose in his lap and waited, because men in this position talk when given silence, long enough and he needed to hear all of it. Min-jae talked. It came out in pieces, uneven and slightly rushed, the way confessions do when they've been held under pressure for too long. He'd been approached by one of Baek's intermediaries 4 months ago, before the summit was even scheduled, before any of this was on the table. The intermediary had framed it as an information exchange, an informal professional relationship, the kind of thing that happens in their world all the time. Min-jae had told himself it was harmless passing contextual information, nothing operational, nothing that would directly hurt anyone. Then the asks had gotten more specific. He wanted the quarterly figures, Min-jae said. His voice was flat, almost toneless, the affect of a man who has moved past being afraid into something grimmer. Not the full picture, just enough to build a story around. He said they only needed one number to look wrong, that the story would do the rest. And you gave it to him. I gave him a version of it. A version. I changed one figure, the Northern distribution payment, made it look like it went out late. Min-jae looked at the table. One number, 300 million won. I moved the date on a transaction report. Jae-Min was quiet. Why, he said. Min-jae looked up. His eyes were dry, which was somehow worse than if they hadn't been. Because Baek made me an offer, a position in the restructured operation, running my own corridor, not managing someone else's. My own operation. He paused. I've been working under your system for 6 years. I'm good at what I do. I'll never move up in your structure because there's no room to move. So you helped dismantle it. I told myself it was lateral movement. You told yourself what you needed to. Min-jae said nothing. Jae-Min leaned forward, not aggressively, just closing the distance slightly, enough to change the register of the conversation. Here's what I want to know. Not the what, I know the what. I want to know what you thought happened to people who did this. Min Jae's throat moved. I thought, by the time anyone knew it was me, the structural change would already be done. Baek would have the corridor. I'd be in a new position. There wouldn't be a reason to. There wouldn't be a point in. You thought I wouldn't come for you if it was already over. Yes, Jameson sat back. He looked at Min Jae for a long moment, at the tight jaw and the dry eyes and the hands gripping his own knees, at the whole picture of a man who had made a calculated decision and was now sitting 3 feet from the consequences of it. He felt the anger in his chest, the hot wire of it, and he breathed through his nose and let it stay there without feeding it. You're going to do something for me, Jae-Min said. Min Jae went very still. You're going to write out, in detail, everything you passed to Baek's intermediary. Every conversation, every figure, every date. You're going to do it tonight in this room, with Byung-soo as witness. You're going to sign it. He paused. And then you're going to be done with the organization, permanently and quietly, and you're going to leave the city. Min Jae blinked. I'm not going to what? Min Jae stopped. Jae-Min looked at him carefully. You have a daughter, 9 years old. She goes to the school on Hongsabyolro. Your mother lives in Suwon. He said it without inflection, without threat in his voice, just fact, stated plainly, the way you state facts. You made a stupid decision for a comprehensible reason. You wanted more. You used the wrong method. I understand the calculation even though I find it disgusting. He stood. Write the statement. Leave the city. And if Baek ever asks you for anything again, you tell him you were made, and you tell him what document exists, and what it contains. He walked to the door. That's it? Min Jae said to his back. Jae-Min turned, looked at him once more. That's not mercy, he said. That's a leash. Understand the difference. He left. Byung-soo was waiting in the hallway. You heard, Jae-Min said. Everything. Get the statement done. I want it in the safe before midnight. They walked toward the elevator. Byung-soo kept pace, and Jae-Min could feel the specific quality of his silence, kind that meant something was being held back. Say it, Jae-Min said. Baek is going to move on the corridor vote before the next scheduled summit. He's going to call an emergency session. He's got 6 votes confirmed. Now Lee Myung-jae shifted. Jae-Min stopped walking. Byung-soo stopped with him. Lee Myung-jae, the man who had warned him this morning in the side room, who had given him the information about the internal leak for free, as a gesture of what felt like professional respect, who had looked at him with those tired, honest eyes and said, come in strong today. When? He moved this afternoon, after the summit session. Whatever happened in that room, Byung-soo paused. Whatever he saw, it changed his calculation. Jae-Min thought about what Lee had seen, man who sat at the head of the table and absorbed a room of laughter and then walked out carrying divorce papers without throwing a single thing. He had thought that was controlled. He had thought it read as unbroken. Lee Myung-jae had read it differently. Lee had seen a man absorbing damage. And men who absorb damage, in Lee's 63 years of experience, eventually go down under it. How long before he calls the emergency session? Jae-Min said. 72 hours, maybe less. His aide has already started the notification protocol. 72 hours. Jae-Min pressed the elevator button and looked at the number above the door counting down. Statement from Min Jae, he said. How much of it can I use in the room? As leverage against Baek? As leverage against Baek. Byung-soo thought for a moment. If you produce it as evidence of manipulation, it proves the payment story was fabricated. That recovers your financial credibility. But Baek will deny he directed it. Min Jae only had contact with the intermediary, not with Baek personally. Baek will say Min Jae acted alone, and the room will believe him. The room will choose to believe him, which is the same thing. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. Then I don't use the statement, Jae-Min said. I use it differently. Byung-soo waited. I need to talk to Park Sung-woo. Tonight. Park? He said, come in strong and show me. He wasn't committed to Baek this morning, he was undecided. And Park is the kind of man who follows the person who looks like they have a plan, not the person who looks like they're winning. He looked at the elevator doors. I need to look like I have a plan. Do you have a plan? Jae-Min was quiet for a moment. I'm building one, he said. Park Sung-woo agreed to meet at 11 o'clock. Not at a restaurant, not at a club, at Park's private office near the western waterfront, which said something about the register of the meeting. Park was treating this as business, not social, which was either a good sign or a careful one. Jae-Min arrived exactly on time. Park's office was functional in the way that real power tends to be not decorated for impression, but filled with the actual instruments of work. Maps on one wall, communication equipment, a desk covered in the physical documentation of a man who ran a large operation and didn't fully trust digital records. Park was behind the desk when Jae-Min came in. He stood, shook hands, gestured to the chair across from him. No aide, no assistant, just the two of them. Good. You walked out of that room differently than I expected, Park said, once they were both seated. What did you expect? Honestly, either a confrontation with Baek or a visible effort to stop the laughter. Something reactive. Park laced his fingers on the desk. You just left. Like you had somewhere more important to be. I did. The internal problem. Jae-Min looked at him. Word travels. Word always travels. The question is which version gets to me first. Park paused. I got two versions. One says you've been hemorrhaging from the inside for months, and today confirmed it. The other says you spent the afternoon cutting the wound out. He tilted his head slightly. Which version should I be working with? The second one. Then tell me about the wound, Jae-Min told him. Not all of it. Not the personal details. Not Imani. Not the women or the bodyguard or the dry cleaning account. He told him the operational truth, the leak, the fabricated payment story, the source, and the document that now existed with that source's signature on it. He told him in the flat, specific language of a man presenting facts, not seeking sympathy. Park listened without interrupting, which was the thing Jae-Min most respected about him. When Jae-Min finished, Park was quiet for a moment. You're not going to use it publicly, Park said. No. But Baek knows it exists. He will by morning. Park looked at him steadily. That's a threat, not a strategy. It's both. A threat only works if Baek believes you'll actually use it. If he calls your bluff, then the document goes to the 3 block leaders who are still genuinely decided, Jae-Min said. Not as a weapon, as information. Let them make their own calculation about what kind of organization they want to align with going forward, one that fabricates financial stories to manufacture a political opening, or one that found the leak and handled it in a single afternoon. Park looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite admiration. Something more pragmatic than that, the look of a man recalibrating. You need my vote, Park said. I need you to stop being undecided. Same thing, then yes. Park stood and walked to the window. He stood with his back to Jae-Min, looking at the waterfront, at the lights on the harbor. He was quiet for long enough that Jae-Min could hear the low hum of the building's ventilations and the distant sound of the water. The divorce papers, Park said without turning. In the room today. Jae-Min said nothing. That's not something you planned. No. She timed it. It wasn't quite a question, but Jae-Min answered it anyway. She timed it. Park turned. His face was as unreadable in the way of men who have been managing their expressions in high-stakes rooms for decades. She knew about the summit. I don't know what she knew. He paused. She's thorough, and she's been planning this for longer than I understood at the time. He held Park's gaze. It's done. I'm telling you this because you're going to ask about it, or someone else will, and I'd rather you have the accurate version. Are you going to try to reverse it? No. Park looked at him. Interesting. She made her decision. It's final. He kept his voice even. The summit room today was what it was. I'm not going to pretend that was nothing. But the organization doesn't run on my marriage. It runs on the perception of your stability. Then give me your vote and help me rebuild the perception. Park crossed back to the desk. He sat down. He picked up a pen and held it between 2 fingers the way people do when they're working through something, not yet ready to commit the gesture to paper. If I commit to you, Park said, and Baek calls the emergency session, and it goes to a vote. Then you're on record. Then I'm on record, yes. And if you lose, I won't lose, if you do. Jae-Min looked at him directly. Then you've committed to the wrong side, and you'll manage that the same way. You've managed every wrong side you've ever been on. You're still here, aren't you? Park looked at him. Then slowly he set the pen down. I'll make 2 calls tonight, he said. The undecideds. I won't advocate. I'll just recalibrate the conversation. Point them at the right information. That's all I need. Don't make me regret this. I'll try not to. Jae-Min stood and shook Park's hand and left. In the elevator going down, he pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes for exactly 10 seconds. His heart was running fast. He could feel it in his throat, the specific percussion of it. His hands were steady, but only because he was making them be. He was running on 3 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee, and the compressed, almost violent focuses of a man who has eliminated every alternative option and arrived at the single remaining road. He opened his eyes. He took out his phone and called Byung-soo. Send a message to Baek's people, he said. Tonight. Just 1 line. The statement exists, and the names on it include his intermediary. That's all. Nothing else. Understood. And book me a flight. Byung-soo paused. To where? Jae-Min thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. Atlanta, he said. First available. The silence on the line lasted a beat. That's going to read as Byung-soo started. I know what it reads as. With the emergency session potentially 48 hours away. I know the timing. If you leave the country right now, Baek's people will say you're running. Let them say it. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked through it without stopping, through the glass doors and into the cold night air. If the session happens while I'm gone, Park and the document handle it. If it doesn't, I'll be back in 72 hours. And the trip to Atlanta. He pushed through the building's main doors and stepped onto the pavement. The city was wet from earlier rain, the street lights throwing long yellow reflections across the slick surface. He stood on the pavement and breathed the cold air and felt the ring in his jacket pocket, its familiar pressure. The trip to Atlanta is something I have to do, he said. He hung up. He stood on the wet pavement outside his building and looked up at the sky, heavy, overcast, the same low ceiling it had been all day, and thought about a woman standing in a gallery with sunlight through enormous windows, laughing at something a customer said, completely untouched by any of this. Sent investigators to find her. He'd received the report 6 weeks ago, read it in his office with the door closed, and then filed it in the locked drawer under the ring. He'd known where she was. He'd known she was building something. He'd told himself repeatedly that going there would accomplish nothing, that she'd made herself clear through 47 pages of legal documentation and a handwritten note that left exactly 0 interpretive room. He still knew all of that. He was going anyway, not to bring her back. He had enough clarity left, on this particular night, to be honest with himself about that she was not coming back, and he was not going to ask her to. That door was closed with the specific finality of something that had been not just shut but locked, and the key destroyed. He was going, because she deserved to hear him say the things he'd been thinking in the morning hours for the past 3 months, and she deserved to hear them from his face, in the same room, without attorneys or papers or the mediation of distance. He was going because he was, for the first time in his adult life, someone who understood what he'd had, and the least he could do was say so to the person he'd had it with. He went upstairs. He packed 1 bag, was at the airport by 2 in the morning. The flight was 14 hours. He slept for 3 of them, which was more than he'd slept in any continuous period in the last several weeks, and woke somewhere over the Pacific with a specific dream, dissolving before he could hold it, something about a room and a coffee cup, and Imani's hand on the back of his chair tray before a meeting he'd been nervous about, steadying him without touching him. He sat in his seat in business class and watched the darkness outside the window and thought about what he was going to say. He ran through versions of it for hours. None of them were right. None of them were adequate. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life mastering the architecture of persuasion, knowing which argument to place first, which pressure to apply, how to read a room and calibrate his language in real time to produce the outcome he needed. He was extraordinarily good at this. He could not find the right words for this, because the right words weren't a strategy. They were the truth, and the truth was not something he could arrange to land well. It was just true, and it landed however it landed, and she would receive it however she received it. He landed in Atlanta at 6 in the evening local time. The coastal city was 3 hours south of Atlanta. By car, he'd had Byung-soo book the car service before he boarded. Some American company with clean vehicles and no unnecessary conversation, which was what he needed. He changed in the airport bathroom, a fresh shirt from his bag, looked at his own face in the fluorescent light of an airport mirror, and thought, without particular emotion, that he looked exactly like a man who had been awake most of a transatlantic night and had spent the day before it in the worst professional meeting of his life. Not ideal. He got in the car. The drive south took the full 3 hours. Night came down as they moved through Georgia, the specific deep darkness of American countryside, pine trees pressing close to the highway, the occasional cluster of gas station lights burning against the black. He looked out the window the whole way and said nothing to the driver, and tried to get his mind into something like the right shape. He didn't know what the right shape was. The car stopped in front of the gallery at 9:17 in the evening. The gallery was closed. He'd known it would be closed. Through the enormous front windows, he could see the interior lit by track lighting over the artwork paintings, photographs, sculptures on low platforms, a large space that was quiet and deliberately beautiful in the way of places built by someone with a specific and serious aesthetic. He stood on the pavement outside and looked through the glass. He could see one of her photographs on the far wall. Not a piece in the gallery her photograph, the one from her college roommate's wedding, the one she'd framed and kept on the wall of their bedroom in Incheon for 3 years. He could just make it out from where he stood. She'd hung it here. He didn't know why that hit him as hard as it did. He had her address. The investigators had been thorough. He'd told himself, in the car, that arriving at her home unannounced at 9 o'clock at night, after flying 14 hours, was not the beginning of a conversation. It was a violation of a boundary, and he would wait until morning and go to the gallery when it opened and do this with whatever civility was still available to them. He stood on the pavement for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called the number his investigators had given him. It rang 4 times. Hello, her voice. Clear, alert, she hadn't been asleep. Slightly guarded, the way anyone sounds answering a number they don't recognize. It's me, he said. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. I know, she said. I'm outside the gallery. Another silence. Longer. I flew in tonight, he said. I know, he stopped. Try it again. I'm not here to change anything. I know what the papers mean. I understand they're final. He stopped again, because none of the sentences he'd rehearsed were coming out right. And standing on a wet American pavement at 9 in the evening, they all sounded like exactly what they were: a man trying to find language for something that had moved past what language could easily hold. He heard her exhale. Give me 20 minutes, she said. The line went quiet. He stood on the pavement outside the gallery, with his bag at his feet and the cold night air off the ocean somewhere behind the buildings, and waited. Not because he expected anything specific to come from this, but because after everything, the summit, the laughter, the 47 pages, the ring, the 14 hours in the air, this was the thing that still felt necessary. Not a strategy, not leverage, just the one true thing left that he could still do. The gallery lights shifted. The front door opened. Imani Caldwell Kwan stood in the doorway of her gallery in jeans and a dark green sweater her color, the one she'd never worn in Incheon because she'd been wearing burgundy for him, and looked at the man standing on the pavement outside with his single bag and his unslept face and the ring she'd last seen on a marble floor 3,000 miles away, and said nothing for a very long moment. He said nothing either. The space between them was no longer 3 years of marriage, or 47 pages of legal documentation, or the particular accumulated weight of every small and large failure between two people who had wanted different things from the same relationship. It was just distance, and he had come this far. He took one step toward the door. She didn't move back. She didn't move forward. She stood in the light of her own gallery, in her own color, in the life she had built out of the wreckage of the one they'd shared, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, not cold, not warm, not the anger he'd braced for, or the indifference he'd feared. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman who has processed a great deal and is not finished yet, and is looking at the source of the processing standing on her doorstep at 9 in the evening in a country he had never once visited. She stepped back from the doorway, not away from him to the side, creating a space just wide enough to be an invitation without being a welcome. The distinction was precise, and she made it precisely, which was so entirely her that something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't try to name. He picked up his bag and stepped through the door. The gallery was warm after the night air outside. It smelled like wood and something faintly chemical linseed oil, maybe, or the particular smell of new canvas. Track lighting threw clean white light across the walls, hitting the artwork at careful angles that made each piece look like it was generating its own glow. It was a serious space, not pretentious. Serious, which is a different thing. Since the kind of space built by someone who understood what they were doing and had made every decision on purpose. He stood just inside the door and looked at it. "You can put the bag down," Imani said. She was already moving toward the back of the gallery, toward a doorway that led to what looked like a back office. "I'll make coffee." He set the bag down beside the door. He didn't follow her immediately. He walked slowly through the gallery instead, looking at the work on the walls. Paintings, mostly bold, contemporary, the kind of work that wasn't immediately comfortable but pulled you toward it anyway. A series of large-scale photographs near the back wall, cityscapes taken at specific hours of early morning, that particular light that exists only for about 12 minutes, before the city fully wakes up. Whoever had made them had been patient, had gotten up before dawn repeatedly and stood in empty streets and waited for exactly the right thing. He recognized that quality of attention. He stopped in front of a painting near the center of the room, a large canvas, maybe 4 feet by 5, deep blues and blacks, with a thread of warm amber running through the lower third. It wasn't representational. It was just feeling rendered in color and shape. The kind of thing that either meant nothing to you or meant too much. It meant too much. He heard Imani come back in. He didn't turn. "Who made this?" he said. "A woman from Savannah. Her first show." A pause. "She almost didn't let me hang it. She said it was too personal." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that was the whole point." He turned. Imani was standing 10 feet away with 2 mugs, both hands occupied, looking at him with that expression, the one from the doorway, complicated and not finished. The face of a woman who has had 3 months of distance and 47 pages of legal finality and is still, somehow, not done processing the man in front of her. She crossed to a small seating area near the office doorway, 2 chairs and a low table, the kind of casual arrangement that exists in working spaces, not designed for guests but functional, and set the mugs down. He walked over and sat in one of the chairs. She sat in the other. They were maybe 4 feet apart, which was closer than they'd been in 3 months and somehow farther than anything else. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at him. "You look terrible." "I know. When did you last sleep?" "On the plane. A few hours." She nodded once, the slight nod of a woman cataloging information. "How's the summit?" He looked at her. "You know about the summit." "I know about the divorce papers getting delivered there." She held his gaze. "My attorneys confirmed delivery. I knew the timing." He absorbed that. "You timed it deliberately." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at her coffee. "Because I wanted you to feel it in the room where you'd said it. With the same people in the audience." She paused. "I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not asking you to." She looked back up. "I'm not asking you to apologize for anything," he said. "I didn't come here to litigate the last 3 months. Or the last 3 years. Then why did you come?" He held her gaze. "Because you deserve to hear some things from my actual face. Not through attorneys. Not through 47 pages. From me in person looking at you." Imani was quiet. She didn't tell him to go ahead. She didn't give him the courtesy of a prompt. She just waited, with the patient steadiness that had always been one of her most unnerving qualities, the ability to simply hold a silence without filling it, without rescuing anyone from the discomfort of their own words. He'd always handled silences by talking through them. He did it now. I understood what I lost about 3 weeks after you left, he said. Not who I lost what, the function of it, the way things ran. And I told myself that was grief, and that grief was the appropriate response, so I was processing correctly. He stopped. It took me another month to understand that was still the wrong way to think about it, that I was still categorizing you, what you did, your value. She said nothing. I don't know when I stopped seeing you as a person, he said. I know it happened gradually. I know there wasn't a specific day where I decided to stop. But at some point in the last 3 years, I started treating your attention like a resource I was entitled to, and your absence like an operational problem. And I didn't notice I was doing it because it was working, everything was running. Everything was smooth, and I thought that was just how things were. He looked at his hands. I went back and counted, he said. The number of times I said thank you, in 3 years, for specific things, not automatically, not the reflexive thing. Actually stopped and said it, he paused. I got to 6, and I'm not certain all 6 were real. Imani's grip on her mug shifted slightly. He saw it. I'm not telling you this to ask for anything, he said. I'm not here to negotiate. I read the papers, I understand what they mean, and I'm not going to insult either of us by pretending I think there's something to reverse. He looked up at her. I'm here because you gave me 3 years of your actual life. You built something inside my world that kept it from falling apart, and you never once required me to acknowledge it because you were just that way. That's who you are. His voice went slightly rough at the edges. He didn't try to smooth it, and I treated that like furniture. And I'm sorry, I'm telling you, I'm sorry because it's true, and because you should hear it, and because I will spend a long time carrying the specific weight of what I threw away. And that's as it should be. The gallery was very quiet. Imani looked at him for a long time. She wasn't crying. He hadn't expected her to be crying. She wasn't cold either. It was more complex than cold. She was looking at him the way you look at something you've already come to terms with and are now seeing again from the other side of that process. Not restarting it, not undone, just looking. I know you mean that, she said finally. Her voice was even, but not detached. There was something real in it, something that wasn't performance. He waited. I also need you to understand something, she said, because I think you came here with a picture of what happened to us, and I think the picture is partly right, but not all the way right. He said nothing. Listening. She set her mug down on the table, folded her hands in her lap. You didn't just stop seeing me. I let myself stop being seen. She paused. I got so good at being invisible in that world that I started to disappear even to myself. I would fix things before you noticed they needed fixing, because I had learned that you didn't, that you weren't built to notice. And instead of telling you that, instead of saying it out loud and making it a real conversation, I just got more efficient at the invisible work. She looked at the painting across the room, the one he'd been standing in front of when she came back with the coffee. I made myself indispensable and then resented you for depending on me. That's not entirely your failure. He looked at her. It's not a both sides argument, she said quickly, reading his expression. What you said at that party, that wasn't a slip. That was what was actually in you. And the party was the end of a long pattern, not a single incident. She met his eyes directly. But I stayed longer than I should have, because I kept believing that if I was just more present, more useful, more patient, you would eventually see me. And that's on me. I chose that every morning for 3 years. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Heavier and somehow more honest. The thing that hurt most, she said, wasn't the comment. It was that I wasn't surprised by it. I heard it and I thought, yes. That's what he actually thinks. And the worst part was knowing I'd known it for a long time and kept pretending otherwise. Jae-Min sat with that. He didn't try to argue it, didn't try to soften it. He sat with it the way it needed to be sat with, and it cost him something to do that, to stay in the discomfort of being accurately seen and not move to manage it. Was there a version, he said carefully, where it could have been different? If I had... Don't, she said, not unkindly. Don't do that. Don't build the hypothetical marriage where you were a different person. That's not a useful thing for either of us to sit in. I'm asking because I want to understand what I need to actually change. Not for you. For he stopped. I'm 40 years old next year. I'd like to not spend the rest of my life being the man I was in that penthouse. Imani looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that was almost sad and almost kind at the same time. The expression of a woman who has suffered something and survived it and can now afford to look at its source without flinching. You want my honest answer, she said. Yes. You don't have a seeing problem, she said. You see things extremely clearly. That's part of why you're good at what you do. You notice everything in a room that matters to you. She paused. The problem is what you've decided matters. You look at a room, and you see power structures and leverage and weakness and opportunity, and you are very fast and very accurate with all of that. But individual people, the specific texture of their inner life, that's not data your system's set up to collect. She held his gaze. You'd have to slow down for that. Not just be more attentive. Actually slow the whole thing down. And I don't know if you're capable of that without dismantling most of what makes you, you. He was quiet. That's not me saying you're broken, she said. I'm saying the machine you built works very well for what you built it for. I just wasn't a good fit for the machine. You're saying it's structural. I'm saying it would take more than trying harder. She uncrossed her hands. And I'm saying that whether you do that work or not, you should do it for yourself. Not to be the kind of man someone will come back to. Because that's just another form of the same problem. Another outcome to optimize for. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. Do you? I'm learning to. She looked at him, at his face, at the specific quality of his exhaustion, at whatever she could read in him from 3 feet away and 3 months of distance and 3 years of being the person who had paid the closest attention to him. Okay, she said quietly, just that. Okay, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something more modest and more real acknowledgement. 2 people sitting in the same room and being honest with each other, possibly for the first time, possibly too late, but doing it anyway. He reached into his jacket pocket. He set the ring on the table between them. Not placed with intention, not a gesture, not an offering. Just set it down, the way you set down something you've been carrying that belongs to someone else. Imani looked at it. She didn't pick it up. Keep it, she said. He looked at her, not as something to hold on to. Not for whatever reason you've been carrying it. She met his eyes. Just it's yours. It was always as much yours as mine. Keep it if it means something, or don't, but I don't need it back. He looked at the ring on the table for a long moment. Then he picked it up, put it back in his pocket. He stood. She stood with him, and for a moment they were both standing in the warm light of her gallery, 4 feet apart. The whole weight of what they'd been to each other settled between them like something that had finally come to rest. The gallery is good, he said. What you've built here. I know. She said it without vanity, just fact. She knew it. She'd made it, and she knew what it was. The photographer, he said. The morning cityscapes, near the back Chang. He's 26. He drives 4 hours to get here from Macon. He'll be significant. Imani smiled. It was small and real, and the first fully unguarded thing her face had done since he walked through the door. Think so too. They walked to the front of the gallery. He picked up his bag. She held the door. He stepped out into the night air and turned to look at her in the doorway, in her green sweater, in the warm light of her own space, in her own life. And he thought about the painting on the wall and the 12-minute morning light, and the woman from Savannah who almost didn't show work that was too personal, and all of it added up to something he didn't have words for. But that was true. I'm glad you're okay, he said. I'm better than okay, she said. He believed her. Take care of yourself, Jae-Min. It was the first time she'd used his name the whole evening. He nodded. She closed the door. He stood on the pavement and watched the gallery light through the glass for a moment. The paintings, the photographs, the amber thread in the blue-black canvas, and then he picked up his bag and walked toward the car. He stayed in the city one more night, not near the gallery. He checked into a hotel on the waterfront and sat on the small balcony in the dark for a long time, looking at the ocean. The American South in November was warmer than Incheon, not warm, exactly, but softer. The air had a different texture. Somewhere down on the waterfront, a restaurant was still open, the sound of music and voices carrying up in fragments. He sat there for 2 hours. He thought about what she'd said, not the apology parts, not the acknowledgement of his failures, but the other thing, part about herself. The admission that she had also made choices, had also constructed something that wasn't entirely honest, had also stayed longer than she should have because she was still hoping the machine would reconfigure itself for her. He turned that over for a long time. He had expected to be indicted. He had prepared himself for a version of that conversation in which he sat across from the accurate accounting of everything he'd done wrong and received it without defense. He had steeled himself for her anger, her contempt. The blade of her specific intelligence turned on him with the full benefit of 3 months of distance and clarity. He hadn't expected her to implicate herself, and the strange thing, the thing he kept returning to, was that it hadn't made him feel better. It hadn't distributed the weight or softened his culpability. It had done something different, something harder. It had made her real to him in a way that he recognized with a dull and private shame. She had not been fully real to him when they were married. He had loved her in the possessive, ambient way of men who love things they haven't examined. He had loved the idea of her steadiness, her competence, the specific texture of comfort that came from having her in a room. He had not loved her particular inner life, her own ambitions, the things she carried, and the things she was afraid of, and the decisions she made in the part of herself that existed before and outside of him. He knew that now. He knew it now the way you know things, after you've lost the chance to do anything about them. His phone lit up on the table beside him. Byung-soo. He answered. The emergency session was called, Byung-soo said. Scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. That's fast. Baek is moving while you're out of the country. It's a calculated read on the optics. Jae-Min looked at the ocean. And Park? Park made his calls. 2 of the 3 undecideds came back into your column this morning. The third is still holding. Which third? Byung-soo named him. Jae-Min ran the name through his memory, a man in his late 50s who ran southern port operations, pragmatic, deeply unsentimental, the kind of man who always voted with whoever he believed was going to be standing at the end. What does he need? Jae-Min said. I think he needs to see you in the room. I'll be in the room. The session is tomorrow at 3. Your flight booked me on the first morning flight. He looked at the sky clouds, stars behind them, the deep Atlantic dark. I'll be there. What about the Min Jae statement? Baek's people haven't responded to the message we sent. They won't. He'd expected this. Baek is betting that I won't use it, because using it opens a conversation about internal leaks, and internal leaks make me look vulnerable regardless of the outcome. He's right that it's a complicated weapon. He thought for a moment. It's not the statement that matters. It's what the statement represents. 3 of our block leaders know it exists. They know it means I found the problem and handled it in 24 hours. That's the message, not the document itself. Byung-soo was quiet for a moment. You sound clearer. I had a useful conversation. With her. Not a question. Jae-Min let the pause answer it. How is she? Byung-soo said. He'd met Imani 4 times, brief professional occasions, but he'd always been, Jae-Min realized, only now quietly respectful in her presence in a way that was distinct from his deference to Jae-Min. He'd respected her on her own terms. She's good, Jae-Min said. She's better than good. She built something real. I'm glad, so am I. He stood up from the balcony chair. Get me on the morning flight. I'll call you when I land. He hung up. He stood at the balcony railing and looked at the ocean for another few minutes. The water moved with the steady, impersonal rhythm of something that had been moving since before every problem he currently had and would continue moving after. He found it steadying in a way he hadn't expected. He went inside and slept. For the first time in weeks, he slept without fragments of dreams waking him at 3-hour intervals. He slept through to the alarm, 6 hours of something approaching genuine rest, and woke in a hotel room in an American coastal city in the gray early light and lay there for a moment, oriented but not rushing. He thought about the painting in the gallery, the amber thread. He got up. He showered, dressed, and checked out of the hotel. At the airport, He sat in the departures hall with a coffee and his phone and worked through the block leader situation with the specific and focused attention of a man who has gotten some sleep and eaten a real meal and sat alone with the ocean for 2 hours and is, now, for the first time in a long time, thinking clearly. He made 2 calls before boarding. The first was to the undecided Southern Port boss. The man answered on the second ring. He'd been expecting the call, which meant Bake's people had already reached him, which meant the timing mattered. Jae-Min didn't pitch him, didn't persuade. He laid out 3 specific operational facts: the Northern consolidation, the Daejeon contract completion, the resolution of the internal security issue in about 4 minutes, and then he said, "I'll be in the room at 3 o'clock. What you do with your vote is your decision, and I'll respect it either way." The man was quiet for a moment. "I'll be in the room too," he said. Which wasn't a commitment, but it wasn't a no. The second call was to Lee Myung-jae. Lee answered after 3 rings. There was background noise, the sound of a car interior, the low murmur of a radio. "I know why you're calling," Lee said. "Then I'll be brief. You shifted yesterday afternoon." "I did. I want to know why, specifically. Not politically your reason." A pause. The car noise continued. "You walked out of that room carrying divorce papers, and you didn't show anything," Lee said. "I've sat in that room for 30 years. I've seen men lose important things and show nothing. Most of the time the nothing is performance. It cracks in the hallway, or that evening, or by the following week." Another pause. "I thought yours was performance. I wanted to see what was underneath it. And you voted with Bake to find out. I voted with Bake to apply pressure and see what you did under it." Jae-Min absorbed this. It was, he had to acknowledge, not an irrational strategy. "And now you've seen what I did under it. I've heard what you did. You flew to America." "Yes." "You left the country 48 hours before an emergency session." "Yes." Silence. "That's either the most reckless thing I've seen in 30 years, Lee said, or it's the most human." He said the word with a particular quality, not softness exactly, but something like it. "I haven't decided which. Does the distinction change your vote?" A very long pause. "Get on your plane," Jae-Min Lee Myung-jae said. "Be in the room at 3. The line went quiet. Jae-Min stared at his phone for a moment. Then he finished his coffee, picked up his bag, and walked to the gate. He landed in Incheon at 7:40 in the morning Korean time. He went directly from the airport to the secondary office, not the penthouse, not yet. He had 3 hours before the session, and he used all of them. He went through the Min-jae statement with Byung-soo in the first hour, confirming every detail and establishing exactly which elements were usable and in what sequence if the session went wrong. He reviewed the corridor documentation. In the second hour, the full legal and operational history of the consolidation, refreshing himself on the specific procedural argument so that he could dismantle Bake's challenge on its own terms without reference to politics or personality. In the third hour, he sat alone in the secondary office and did nothing. He sat at the table where Min-jae had sat 2 nights ago and looked at the wall and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way he'd learned to do in his 20s, during the first years of building something in a world that wanted to consume him before he could get it built. He thought about what Imani had said. The machine works very well for what you built it for. She was right. And it was also true that the machine had been running without proper maintenance for 3 months, on the fumes of its own momentum, and it had started to show. He had let personal chaos bleed into professional space, and he had been slow to stop the bleeding because the personal chaos was connected to a grief he hadn't been willing to sit with directly. He was sitting with it now. He didn't like it. He did it anyway. 2:45 he left for the estate. The session room looked the same as it always did. He arrived before anyone else except the estate staff, who showed no reaction to his presence. They showed no reaction to anything, which he'd always respected. He stood at the head of the table and looked at the 12 chairs and thought about the shape of what was about to happen. At 3 o'clock, the room filled. Dae-hun Baek came in midway through the arrivals, and when he saw Jae-Min at the head of the table, the only visible change in his expression was a slight compression of his mouth there, and gone in half a second, a micro-expression of recalculation. He'd gambled that Jae-Min would still be in America. That gamble had not paid off. Lee Myung-jae came in last. He sat in his usual chair, 4 seats down on the left, and when he met Jae-Min's eyes across the table, he gave a single nod that was so brief it might not have happened. Jae-Min gave the same nod back. The session opened. Baek's corridor challenge came in the second procedural item. He presented it with the same careful language as before, the formality of it, the technical argument, the positioning of himself as a man of process rather than a man of ambition, which was the performance required by the context. Jae-Min let him finish. Then he spoke. He spoke for 9 minutes this time, shorter than before. He addressed the procedural challenge directly and then set it aside, because the procedural challenge was not the actual subject of the meeting, and everyone in the room knew it. He talked about the corridor consolidation in operational terms, what it had taken, what it had produced, what the 18 months since had looked like in numbers that he laid out with specific and unambiguous precision. Then he paused. He looked at Baek. "I want to address the payment story," he said. The room went still. The story that circulated in the past several weeks about a delayed Northern contract payment. I want every person in this room to understand that the payment in question was made on time, correctly, and documented, and that the story was constructed from a falsified transaction report generated by a source inside my organization who has since been identified, confronted, and removed. He paused. The documentation of that conversation exists. I'm not going to produce it in this room because doing so would turn this into something different from what it should be. But every person in this room who has questions about it can request to see it privately. He looked around the table, held the silence for exactly the right duration. The corridor is settled, he said. The consolidation was procedurally sound, operationally justified, and has produced 18 months of results that any operational review will confirm. If there are specific procedural concerns that weren't resolved at the time, I'm prepared to walk through every detail. He looked at Baek one more time, without heat, without theater, just directly. But I think the room understands what this session is actually about. And I'd rather we save everyone's time by just saying so. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Park Sung-woo said, from his seat, "The corridor question is resolved as far as I'm concerned. I'd like to move to the next item." One of the other block leaders, Oh Chang-seok, the aggressive one, the forward leaner, said, "Agreed." The Southern Port boss said nothing, but his face had settled into a neutral that leaned in one direction. Baek looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, with the precise control of a man swallowing something that has cost him significantly, "Agreed. The corridor question can be set aside. The vote never happened. There was nothing to vote on." The session moved to the next item, and then the item after that, and the room functioned the way it was supposed to function, which was the only outcome that mattered. An hour later, as people were filing out, Lee Myung-jae walked past Jae-Min without stopping. But he put one hand briefly on the table. Beside Jae-Min's a contact, so brief it barely counted as contact, and then he was past and heading for the door. It was the closest thing to well done that existed in their language. Jae-Min held it for a moment. Then he collected his papers and left. Penthouse felt different when he got back. He stood in the entrance hall, the marble floor, the place where her ring had been, and looked around at the space with the particular eye of a man who has been away long enough to see it freshly. It was too large. It had always been too large. It was designed to impress rather than to inhabit, built around the logic of a man who measured security in square footage and thought that abundance was its own kind of proof. He walked through it slowly. The living room, with its art that he'd never actually looked at. Kitchen that he'd learned, badly, to operate in her absence. The bedroom with his side of the bed, and the nightstand with the Korean thriller, still sitting with its bookmark unmoved. 5 months now, the bookmark a small monument to aspirations he hadn't followed through on. He picked up the book. He looked at it for a moment. Then he walked to the window and stood there, the book in his hand, looking at the city. Incheon spread below him in its usual configuration, lights and water, and the dense logic of a place that had been accumulating itself for decades without reference to him. He had spent years looking at this view with the quiet satisfaction of a man surveying something he owned. He looked at it now and felt something different. Not less, exactly. Just differently oriented. The city was not his. It had never been his. He was one of the things happening in it, and the things happening in it did not require his dominion to keep happening. He opened the book to the bookmark. He sat down on the couch that faced the window. He read. He read for an hour, then another. He got further into the book than he had in 5 months of owning it, because he was sitting still, actually sitting still, and giving the thing his attention without reserving part of it for the management of everything else. Around 10 o'clock he made coffee. He made it correctly, without having to think about it, which meant he'd made it enough times now that it had become something he simply knew. He carried the mug back to the couch and looked at the city and thought about a gallery 3,000 miles away, and a green sweater, and a painting with an amber thread, and a 26-year-old photographer who drove 4 hours to get there. He thought about the 12-minute light, the patience required to stand in an empty street and wait for exactly the right thing. He thought about Imani sitting across from him in those 2 chairs and saying, "I also need you to understand something," and the courage it had taken to do that, to implicate herself in the honest accounting of what had happened between them, when it would have been easier and arguably more comfortable to let him carry the whole weight of it. She had not let him carry the whole weight of it. She had, right up until the end, been more generous than he deserved. He sat with that for a long time. The city pulsed below. The coffee cooled in his mug. He didn't move to reheat it. Penthouse sold 6 months later. He moved to a smaller apartment closer to the water, not modest, but different. Place with a single bedroom and a kitchen. He could navigate without instructions and windows that looked at the harbor from a lower angle, closer to it, part of the city, rather than above it. Kept the book. He finished it. He started another one. The syndicate restructuring took most of a year. He didn't step away cleanly. Clean exits didn't exist in his world, and he was honest enough with himself to know that any claim of a clean exit was a story he'd be telling himself. But he pulled back from the operational center, transferred legitimate business interests to professional management, and declined, systematically, to participate in the things that required him to be the specific man he was trying not to be anymore. Baek never mounted another challenge. Not because the Min-jae statement had deterred him. Jae-Min suspected in his more clear-eyed moments that Baek had simply looked at the session room that afternoon and made a pragmatic calculation. A man who flew to America in the middle of a power struggle to have an honest conversation with his ex-wife, and then came back to win the room anyway, was either reckless beyond understanding or operating from a position of genuine confidence. And Baek was not the kind of man who misread the distinction indefinitely. Lee Myung-jae retired the following spring. He sent Jae-Min a brief note, 1 paragraph, handwritten, which in their world was the equivalent of a significant gesture. Park Sung-seung-woo became the effective center of the consortium going forward, which suited everyone, including Jae-Min. Jung-soo stayed. Jae-Min had expected him to move when the restructuring made it logical for him to move, but he didn't. He transitioned into a different role, less tactical, more administrative, with the quiet adaptability of a man who had been loyal long enough that loyalty had become a feature of his character rather than a professional calculation. Jae-Min never asked him why he'd stayed. He thought he understood it. The magazine was on his desk at the new apartment on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. 2 years after the night, his shoe had caught on something small on a marble floor. Not a major publication, an arts journal, the kind that gets passed around by people who care about that particular world. He'd subscribed to it on impulse 6 months earlier, the way you make small gestures toward the person you're trying to become. He was flipping through it absently, standing at his kitchen counter with his coffee, when he saw the photograph. A full-page color. The gallery, her expanded gallery, twice the size now, with new skylights that she'd told him about. That evening, she'd mentioned them in passing, that she was considering the expansion. She'd gone through with it. The interior was warm and crowded with people on opening night, some kind of event, and in the center of it, Imani stood in a deep green dress, her curls loose, laughing at something the man beside her had just said. Sunlight from the skylights, catching her face at an angle that made her look, there was no other word, luminous. She looked like someone who had built the exact life she intended and was standing in the middle of it without reservation. He stood at his kitchen counter for a long time, looking at the photograph. He thought about what she'd said, "I'm better than okay." He had believed her in that moment, and he believed her again now, looking at the proof of it, the gallery, the green dress, the particular quality of that laugh, the laughter of someone who is not managing anything, not performing, not protecting any part of herself from the room she's standing in. He had done that to her. He had taken a woman capable of that kind of presence and made her careful and invisible and measured, and she had done it partly to herself, but he had built the conditions for it. And the weight of that was something he had learned to carry without putting it down. Closed the magazine, set it on the counter, picked up his coffee, looked at the harbor through the window of his smaller apartment. He had spent his adult life believing that winning meant holding something no one else could take from you. He'd built an empire on that belief. He had measured every relationship, every alliance, every room he walked into, by whether it increased or decreased his capacity to hold things. Imani had not been something he'd held. She had been someone who had chosen him, and then chosen him again, every day for 3 years, until the day she finally chose herself instead. And the thing about people who choose you, the thing he understood now, standing at his kitchen window in the early light of a Thursday morning, is that they don't owe you that choice. It is not a resource. It is not a possession. It is not an entitlement that comes with a ring or a contract or the operational advantage of having organized your world. It is a gift, given freely or not at all. He had not known how to receive it. He was learning. Not quickly, not cleanly, not with the kind of transformation that looks tidy from the outside. He still caught himself, in rooms and in conversations, running the old calculations, the leverage reading, the power mapping, the reflexive assessment of what each person in a space could be worth to him. He caught himself, and he stopped himself, and he asked, with the patience of someone practicing something difficult, what else was true about the room he was standing in? What was the person across from him actually saying? What were they afraid of? What had they built? It was slow work. He was doing it anyway. He set his coffee down and picked up his phone and dialed his mother in Busan a call he'd been making more frequently since the year turned. The calls getting longer as he got better at talking, without needing the conversation to produce an outcome. She answered on the second ring. Jae-Min. The warmth in her voice was the same it had always been, which he'd taken for granted for most of his life, and noticed now every single time. Yama, he said. How are you? I'm good. Are you eating? I'm eating. You always say that. This time it's true. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the harbor. I made soup yesterday, from scratch. A brief silence. Then she laughed a real laugh, surprised and delighted. You made soup, it was bad, he said, but I made it. She was still laughing when he started talking, really talking, about nothing particular, the new apartment, the harbor view, the arts journal on the counter with a photograph of an art gallery he'd visited once on a pavement in an American city. He didn't explain the photograph, but he talked, and his mother listened, and outside the window the harbor moved with the same indifferent, steady rhythm it always had. And the morning light came in at an angle that was not quite the 12-minute light of those photographs, but was, in its own way, the specific and unrepeatable light of this particular morning, and no other. He stayed on the phone for 40 minutes. When he hung up, the coffee had gone cold. He didn't mind.